Area 51 has become synonymous with aliens due to all the secrets surrounding it and thanks to the help of Bob Lazar. But why keep it such a secret? Especially since they came out and told us that aliens are real. Follow me down the rabbit hole to learn more. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the rabbit hole. I'm your host, Danny, and today we are talking about Area 51 and Bob Lazar because you can't really talk about one without the other. Thank you, Dylan, Austin, Catherine, Kay, and Patrick for requesting this episode. It's been well requested. I'm finally doing it. I know everyone's like, conspiracy theory podcast that hasn't done Area 51? I've just been holding off. But here we go. And of course, okay, before we get started, I love to thank our sponsors. So thank you, Wise Wolf Gold, for sponsoring my podcast. Guys, if you want gold and silver delivered straight to your front door for as little as $50 a month, go to rabbithole.gold right now and let's shop gold and silver together. If you rate my podcast 5 stars, send me over like a screenshot of your rating and your address. I'm sending you stickers. And you can watch this episode on YouTube and on Rumble. You can get merchandise. You can join Patreon. All that's in the show notes. Check it out. I don't want to bore you with all the details. You've heard it enough. So let's get started. Area 51 is a classified United States Air Force base. It's located at Groom Lake, which is dry. It's basically like salt flats now, which is about 120 miles northwest of Las Vegas. It's near the small towns of Rachel and Hyco. Over the years, this military installation has been known by many different names: Paradise Ranch, Watertown, Airstrip, and Dreamland, to name a few. Originally, Groom Lake was built in 1955 to test the U-2 spy plane for the CIA. The CIA used the Atomic Energy Commission as a front to cover up the testing of the U-2 plane, but then realized that people would see these planes flying around and decided instead to tell everyone that these planes were weather research planes. In all reality, they were high-altitude reconnaissance planes. And this is how it actually got the name Area 51, because they were trying to disguise the base as an atomic energy testing site. This cover story didn't really stick, though. They were building hangars and a runway, which they would need to test a weather plane, but somehow it got out that something was just kind of like off about this place. That it held more secrets that they just weren't letting on to. It didn't help that the base itself is fairly small, but the restricted area around it is over 90,000 acres. This base was strategic and secretive because of the Cold War. They wanted a place where they could test their spy planes away from the prying eyes of Russians or anyone colluding with the Russians. By early 1955, newspaper reporters in Las Vegas were calling it the secret proving ground within the proving ground. In 1957, when the U-2 was deployed by the CIA, the test operations moved to Edwards Air Force Base, leaving Groom Lake mostly empty. Or at least that's what they wanted you to believe, right? Because it seemed like after they left, news quieted down and no one really talked about Area 51 for a while. That was until the early 1980s, when UFO and alien rumors started circulating. And by 1989, Bob Lazar became a whistleblower on a project the US government was working on. But now, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's take it way back to July 1947, when a mysterious object crashed near Roswell, New Mexico. So we covered this in the Hangar 18 episode, but let me refresh your memory. In the beginning days of July of 1947, about 75 miles outside of Roswell city limits, Mac Brazel, a rancher, found something unusual in his sheep pasture. It was a mess of metallic sticks held together with tape, chunks of plastic foil reflectors, and scraps of heavy, glossy, paper-like material stretching almost like a mile long and hundreds of yards wide. Brazel didn't know what these things were, so he called the sheriff like anybody would do. Turns out the sheriff also didn't know what these items belonged to, so he called the local military base, Roswell Army Air Force Base. Soldiers went out to the ranch, fanned out across the field, and gathered all the mysterious debris and took it away with them in armored trucks. The next day, this statement was released from that Army base, the Roswell Army Air Force Base. Quote, "The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Air Force, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers in the sheriff's office of Chavez County," end quote. Something that I didn't include in this episode that I did include in Hangar 18 is that flying saucers and different crafts had been spotted all over the country up to this point. There was a pretty big case up in Washington state where this private pilot had seen this weird craft moving in directions and flying at speeds that our aircraft definitely could not do in 1947. So that's what they're talking about in this newspaper article. On the 8th of July, quote, "RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region," was the top story in the Roswell Daily Record. However, just the next day, on July 9th, the Air Force official clarified that it was not, in fact, a flying saucer, but a crashed weather balloon. They don't even look similar. And the official story is still that it was just a weather balloon that crashed in the field and a bunch of small town folks blew it up because, like I said, just a month before, a pilot in Washington state had reported seeing some type of flying object moving faster than any plane could. That sighting had been in the papers around the U.S., so they blamed it on that story. Basically, like, small town folk blew up this whole thing because they read something in the papers. What we know from the Hangar 18 episode is that they took the extraterrestrials they found in the crashed ship that day in Roswell to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. In Hangar 18, on that base, they did tests and experiments on the aliens. But what happened to the ships? The theory is that the ships went to Area 51. For years following the creation of the testing site that is Area 51, locals were seeing UFOs flying around. It is important to remember that UFO stands for Unidentified Flying Object, so it really could be anything flying in the sky that you don't recognize. It could be a drone. Because besides the U-2, they also tested the A-12 SR-71 high-altitude reconnaissance plane and F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter at Area 51. Of course, when researching this episode and looking up Area 51, the official story is that it was just aircraft that hadn't been revealed yet, that the public didn't know about. So technically, yeah, the public was right. It was just unidentified flying objects. I mean, other things had been reported too. It wasn't just these like weird flying things. People were seeing weird lights in the sky. It was a lot of odd behavior in the sky that people were reporting. And they just like chalked it up to, well, we test aircraft here. Yeah, you're going to see weird things. But everything really took off in 1989 when a whistleblower named Bob Lazar spoke out on a Las Vegas TV station about what was happening at Area 51. His story is one of the most well-known and believable due to the number of details he includes and the fact that his story doesn't change that much. Bob Lazar was hired to work as a technician for a contractor company in 1982. This company provided support staff to the Los Alamos Meson Physics Facility in the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Bob said he went to Caltech and MIT and that he's a physicist, obviously well-studied physicist, but both universities say that they have no record of Bob ever attending their universities. And a lot of people point to this, they're like, see, dude's unreliable. He's lying about his credentials. He's not even a physicist. And when you look up, like, the official story, because of course that's what pops up, everyone's like, yeah, he's just some contractor, some technician. He wasn't even an actual physicist. Did we ever think about the fact that maybe, just maybe, the government wiped his records from those universities? Especially because governments have their hands deep in the universities. Our government is deeply tied into them. So if they made a phone call and say, hey, get rid of this guy's credentials, get rid of this guy's everything, they're going to. They're not going to ask very many questions. And who would? Like, if the CIA calls you up, they're like, hey, get rid of this. You're not going to be like, okay, no. Most people are just going to comply. Anyway, Bob stated that he had a majestic clearance, and this clearance level is 38 levels above top secret clearance. Top secret clearance is called Q clearance for civilians. So he had a majestic clearance, which is a civilian clearance. But when it's referred to, he refers to it as Q clearance because that's what it's called for civilians. In May 1989, he appeared in an interview with George Knapp, an investigative reporter for a Las Vegas TV station, to discuss his employment at S4. When he made his appearance, it was under the pseudonym Dennis, and his face was hidden. Later that same year, he would give another interview with his face showing and using his real name, Bob Lazar. He claimed that S4 was a facility near Area 51, adjacent to Papoose Lake, which is in the same area as Groom Lake. But Papoose Lake is south of the main facility at Area 51. At S4, there were concealed aircraft hangars built into the mountainside. That way you did not know that they were there. He claimed that his job was to help reverse engineer flying saucers of extraterrestrial origin. That there were 9 crafts in total, but he only got to do a close inspection on one of them. These flying saucers originated from a planet that orbited the Zeta Reticuli star system. They were made of a metallic substance. He said that when he touched it, it was like cold to the touch, which is why he assumed it was metal. And it looked as though it was like stainless steel. It wasn't very shiny, didn't really have like a finish on it, but also there were no seams and no projectile would penetrate it. The floor was hexagonal, and the entrance of the craft was like a honeycomb structure. And if you put your hand on it and push, the honeycombs would kind of like collapse in on themselves. And it had 2 levels, although the way he explained it seemed like it had 1 level with a below floor access, almost like a crawl space. And in this crawl space, there were 3 gravity amplifiers, and these were what propelled the craft forward. Bob talks extensively about the propulsion system. I think that that's mainly what he was working on these crafts. The propulsion ran on an antimatter reactor and was fueled by the chemical element with atomic number 115. He called it E115. At the time, they named this element ununpentium, and we couldn't actually create it then. Like, we really couldn't artificially create it. We couldn't synthesize it at all for years after this, in fact. The first time it was synthesized was in 2003 and has since been named Moscovium. He said E115 was strictly extraterrestrial, that it might occur naturally in other places, but not on Earth. The propulsion system relied on a stable isotope of E115, which generates a gravity wave that allows the craft to fly. We have not synthesized stable isotopes of this element yet. Some people say that we can't. I'm not a scientist, so I don't know. But the craft moved forward by creating a gravity wave, almost like the polarity of magnets, kind of like how they push each other away. The craft had 3 gravity amplifiers, but would work with just 1. So like it only needed 1 to really get off the ground. But it does need all 3 for space travel. That's how the craft can tilt on its side, point the generators in a single direction, and then move. Which is different than what is usually portrayed in movies, where they're moving kind of like parallel to the ground. They actually move perpendicular to the ground. A big argument is that moving as fast as a craft has been seen moving or has been said to move would kill anything inside. They would like slam into the walls and be killed instantly. But he explains this away. The gravitational field is the only thing that influences you once you're inside it. So inertia would have no effect on you because you would be in a distortion. So gravity distorts time and space, so nothing influences you while in the craft being propelled and in any direction. That's why they can change directions at the drop of a hat. So like I said earlier, he explained that one of the gravity amplifiers would be used to get the craft off the ground, and then it used the other two amplifiers to create the distortion in front of the craft. So the craft is always chasing the distortion in front of it. So instead of basically like using thrust and like pushing backwards, it's actually creating a distortion in front of it to cause this, like he explained it as like a downhill motion where the craft is always chasing the distortion, trying to get to it. So the bigger the gravity distortion in front of it, the faster this alien spacecraft moves. But that's also why they look goofy when they're flying around at lower speeds, especially because the gravity around the Earth is not always constant due to whatever is underneath the surface at like wherever you're flying at. Gravity doesn't vary enough for us to like notice very extremely, but it does affect the aliens' crafts. Bob only witnessed one test flight up close and personal. He said it was inside the hangar, basically like a low performance test, and there was radio communications with the craft, like the people outside were talking to the pilots inside. He said the craft is basically silent. It lifted off the ground and had like kind of a small discharge that indicated there was high voltage, but that dissipated pretty quickly. Then the craft just hovered at about 30 feet off the ground, completely silent. Moved to the left, moved to the right, and then settled back down on the ground. He said scientifically, this was a major feat because gravity isn't something that we fully understand. It's something that we observe. We have many theories about it, but we don't really have anything like super concrete. And we may understand more now. I'm no scientist, like I don't follow science that closely, but this is what Bob was saying in 1989. Because gravity bends time and space, when you are under the craft and you look up at it, you would see what's above it because the light is literally bending around the craft. It's actually like a cool little trick. He said inside the craft, he had this really ominous feeling. It wasn't like a very exciting place to be, but he definitely always felt this ominous feeling. And I'm actually wondering how connected are these crafts with their pilots? Because if the extraterrestrial, the alien, is kind of feeling this ominous feeling because of wherever they're at, Hangar 18 or wherever, then is that why Bob or whoever's going into these aircraft is getting this weird ominous feeling? Just a thought. Bob talked about reading lots of reports on the crafts and the creatures inside the crafts. He talked about seeing autopsy photos of these creatures, but they were really just like headshots, so like head, shoulders, upper torso, and you could see that the upper torso was cut and they had an organ pulled out. You could see the 4 chambers, kind of like alluding to that fact that it's a heart, but he didn't know for sure. But he did say that the alien looked kind of how they describe them in movies and TV shows. So gray with really big eyes and kind of like longer heads. And he didn't know how tall the creatures were because he only saw the pictures of the upper part. But he said that if the picture he saw looked like how Hollywood portrays them, then he assumes the rest of the body looked like that too. Especially because he said the craft was made for something much smaller than a human. So he's thinking that these things are like 3 to 4 feet tall. When asked the relationship between gravity and moving long distances in space, Bob said that the gravity, time, and space are basically all connected. So like I said earlier, the stronger the gravitational pull and the distortion of space and time, it makes the distance between things much shorter. So with our technology, it would take thousands to millions of years to get to some of these places the crafts could get to in a very short time. This happens because they modify the time and the space it takes to get there. So everything's actually much closer. So the distance, like 2 feet for us in what we have available to us, but in a spacecraft, they could do it in like 2 inches because they literally distort the space. That's kind of cool. However, the faster you go, the more your mass increases. So running into things at these speeds would be extremely dangerous. But whatever these crafts are made of is impenetrable And they probably have to be to move that fast through space. He said he was privy to the test flight schedule because he needed to be there during the test flights sometimes. So, yes, he was there for one up close flight, but he also saw distant flights as well. At the time, statistically, Wednesdays were when the least amount of civilian traffic occurred in the surrounding areas. So that's when they did most of their flights. The craft appears as like this glowing light in the sky because of the amount of energy it emits. So when people are reporting that they're seeing these weird lights in the sky and that they're going in weird directions, it really could be an alien craft because they're emitting so much energy. It's kind of like, he explained it kind of like lightning. There's so much energy there that it creates light. So Bob Lazar was involved in Project Galileo, but at the same time, there was all these other different projects going on. So Project Sidekick was also going on. While Galileo was focused on reverse engineering the crafts, Sidekick was working on any weapon systems that might be on the crafts. But they were also wondering if these crafts could be used as a weapon. Of course, leave it to the government to weaponize basically everything. Project Looking Glass is another thing that was going on at the same time. So this kind of dealt with gravity distortion. As we have heard in other theories, they give little bits of a bigger picture to different people. So, for example, Bob was only allowed to work on his one craft. He said only once did he ever even get a glimpse at the other crafts, but he wasn't really even allowed to look at these other crafts. He was supposed to just focus on his one spacecraft. That's it. So that's the same thing with all these different projects. They try to keep the secrecy and they don't want to show the whole picture to any one group of people or any like one person. And this also helped if they had any spies in their midst that they were unaware of. The spy wouldn't have a full picture to give to their home country. They were keeping so many secrets from the employees that worked on the base that they would literally drive the employees to the hangar for work. So they all had to park in a parking lot, then they get on a bus with blacked out windows and were driven to S4 for work on these crafts. Bob recalled a time when he heard a very loud noise outside while he was on the bus, but he couldn't see outside. He could only see out like the big front driver's window. So he asked the supervisor what the noise was and was told that it was a high altitude reconnaissance plane. So he's literally being told the exact same lie that the rest of us are being told. But it didn't seem like Bob was really buying that story. He described what he saw out of the front window of the bus as a triangle type craft with two vanes coming out the back. He said it sounded more like a rocket instead of a jet. And he talked about the time that maybe he was sent a message. So he was driving down the road one time and a white car came up behind him. He remembered hearing a gunshot and the back of his car was hit and then he skidded into like the green grassy median. He was sure that they were going to pull up and shoot him, so he was like paralyzed with fear, but they didn't. They just kind of drove off. As if they were only trying to send him a message, like, shut up, stop talking. He didn't know who was sending him the message. He also didn't really mention, like, when this happened. So I don't know if it was after he started speaking up, but it's interesting. Especially when you put this together with, like, when he was just about to leave, they literally threatened him and his wife's lives when he was, like, leaving the project. They were like, if anything starts to come out about this, you and your wife are in trouble. Of course, he starts speaking out about all these things. And at one point, his old supervisor actually like reached out to him as like kind of like, hey, let's get together. Let's talk. Like, let's just hang out like old buddies. I don't know if they actually were buddies when they worked together, but they set up this time to meet at a hotel. Bob brought two of his friends with him. He was like, I don't really trust this. This is like a weird situation. I don't really trust it. So he brings two friends. He gets there, kind of assesses out the situation. He's smarter than your average Joe. He knows what's up. So he looks around. He's like, I recognize these security guards. I recognize a couple of these people that are pretending to just be random hotel dwellers. But I know who these people are. So he decided not to get together with his old supervisor because he didn't know, like, is this a trap? Do you actually just want to talk? Are you here to send me another message? Are you going to, like, capture me? So he and his friends just, like, bounced. They're like, yeah, we're not doing this. Bob Lazar is still alive and he's doing work with nuclear type things I don't know all the ins and outs of his current life. I know that he isn't really speaking out about Area 51 right now. He's been on a couple podcasts. He's been on the Joe Rogan Experience, of course, but I could not reach out to him to get him on my podcast. Too bad. That would have been really cool. Anyway, we've got other things to cover anyway. So the government didn't formally recognize the existence of Area 51 until 2013. The base is still very secretive and heavily guarded. There are plenty of military bases around the US that civilians are welcome on, and there's others that are strictly for military members, but this installation is highly restricted. Like, the seriousness of the security is shown by a 2019 incident. So a man drove through a security checkpoint near Mercury, Nevada in an attempt to enter the base. He led security on an 8-mile pursuit before exiting his vehicle carrying a cylindrical object, whatever that was. He was actually shot because he refused to halt after many commands from security and the police officers, so he was shot and killed. I'm not saying that he was shot because he was on Area 51. He could have been shot because of his failure to obey commands and to halt. They didn't know what the cylindrical object was. Was it a bomb? Was he going to try to kill them? They were probably fearful for their life. Maybe it was a little bit of both. Honestly, I don't know. But it is very interesting because later in June, you have a Facebook user, Maddie Roberts, who posts that we should all storm Area 51. I'm sure you guys remember this. So he said that there's basically no way that they can stop all of us if we all just get together. Like, if we gather enough people and attempt to access the installation, they couldn't stop all of us, and at least some of the truth about the facility could come to light. The Facebook event literally went viral, and over 2 million people responded to the event as going. On September 20th, 2019, only about 150 people showed up, which is still like a decent amount of people, but no one actually entered the installation. I think they probably just got together. I think they, from what I read back then, they kind of just tailgated at Area 51 and then they went about their day. But outside of those couple of things, there are a couple other theories that have popped up as well. One of them is that Area 51 is a meeting place with extraterrestrials, so we'll get into that kind of a little bit later. Another thought is that this is where they are developing energy weapons for the Star Wars program. So the Star Wars program is actually the Strategic Defense Initiative, a proposed missile defense system intended to protect the U.S. from attacks by ballistic nuclear missiles. This program was announced by President Reagan in 1983 and set up the following year. However, the program has been pretty wishy-washy, with some people saying we're decades away from this working, some material revealing that we have neutralized the arsenal, and some people thinking it's still a super valid way to protect the country. There are some theories that say weather control was developed at Area 51. Some theories say development of time travel and teleportation happened there. And other theories say exotic propulsion systems related to the Aurora program were developed there. So I was like, what Aurora program? Very confused. The Aurora program is officially a myth, but it was rumored to be a mid-1980s American reconnaissance aircraft. It was supposedly developed by Skunk Works, although they also say the aircraft never existed. Skunk Works yep, we weren't a part of that. This legend started when it was released in the Los Angeles Times and later Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine. This aircraft was supposed to be a Mach 5 hypersonic speed replacement for the Lockheed SR-71, which we know was tested at Area 51. That's one of the things they've come out and they're like, yep, we absolutely did that here. I don't know why the Aurora program was completely made up and where two decently prominent mainstream news outlets would get this information if it wasn't true. Or maybe they're hiding the Aurora program from us as well. They don't want anybody to know what we have. Typical government. Speaking of, we really couldn't talk about anything like this without talking about a one world government. So maybe that's why Area 51 is so secretive, because they have an underground facility at Groom Lake or Papoose Lake or both. That is where all the world leaders meet with the aliens and with each other. There is an underground railroad system that connects all the different parts of this underground city. They have basically an alien hotel set up there. So when the aliens come in, they can crash there. They have a cool place. All the world leaders come in and they get to hang out. They talk about matters of the universe. They discuss what Earth needs to be doing. And then the aliens leave. There's also said to be an airstrip there called Cheshire Airstrip. And it is called this because when the asphalt is sprayed with water, it briefly shows a Cheshire cat from Lewis Carroll's book. So that was just kind of fun. But the last thing that I want to bring up is the veterans that have gotten cancer who worked in and around Area 51. Mostly in the 1980s and 90s, veterans who all believed they were exposed to radiation during their missions. The problem is that their work is so top secret that the DoD won't acknowledge that they were even in service. So these service members have tumors and lumps all over their bodies. One guy was showing in this news article that I watched that he had to get all of his teeth taken out. He had to get part of his tongue taken out and his vocal cords taken out. And now he has to eat through a feeding tube. He was beaten up. But he's not the only one. The news outlet that reported on this was saying that these veterans were exposed to nuclear radiation. And that is true. But it makes me wonder what else was or is happening at that base that could have harmed these veterans. But also, isn't there a record of these men going to boot camp or some sort of training before they were stationed in the desert? You would think that there's some lead up. So you could see yes, these servicemen and women were actually in the military. And they were actually their cancer can be service connected. But the VA is denying these men and women treatment because their records are data masked, which basically says they were never there. We can't prove that they were in the desert at the time they say they were. In 1975, a report showed that there was nuclear contamination from the tests that happened there prior to the base being established, as well as depleted uranium, plutonium, and beryllium present. But the government decided that discontinuing the work done at the range would be against the national interest. So instead, let's harm our veterans. One of these veterans has worked to connect with others. So he has connected with over 1,000 men and women who worked at the site, and hundreds of them report being sick. And being a veteran, I think it's important to include this because these men and women are being completely overlooked. Their cancer is ignored. The DoD didn't respond to the claims. The Air Force say they didn't have any records at the time that these men are saying that they were in the Air Force. And the VA is there's no presumption of the exposure, so every vet needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Very VA of them. But the problem is, more than 400 veterans that served at Area 51 and the surrounding desert have already died. And the exposure didn't just affect the members serving at the base, it affected their families as well. Some of their kids have been born with tumors or have been born sick. And these veterans, these families are not getting the help they deserve. And it's being completely overlooked. They're they didn't actually work there. We can't prove that they worked there. It's a conspiracy against them. Their work was too top secret to even allow them to get the medical help that they need years later. And this is actually really scary because this could literally happen to any veteran. So if you're a veteran listening to this, firstly, thank you for your service. I appreciate you. Secondly, make sure that your data is not masked in the VA system, because otherwise, if in the future you get cancer or any ailment that the VA would potentially help you with because it's service connected, they might not help you if your data is masked. So, just another public service announcement. But until next week, my friends, stay skeptical because you never know what the heck is going on in the world. And I'll see y'all then. Hey friends, The Rabbit Hole is an independent podcast with everything you hear done by me, Danny Mercy. I appreciate all of your support. Please rate and review wherever you're listening. If you want to follow us on Instagram, it's at rabbit.holepodcast. And thank you, Zakar Balaha, for our awesome intro.